Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I want to welcome you and thank you for on this beautiful sunny day coming into this theater for one of our talks as part of the Wells Fargo Jazz Series at Spoleto Festival USA. Please help me welcome Vijay Iyer, our guest for today. Thank you. I'm Larry Blumenfeld. I curate the Jazz Series here. And when I'm not doing this, I write about music and culture for the Wall Street Journal, other places. I edit Chamber Music Magazine. And in all the walks of the things that I've done, I've considered Vijay's music and his approach to culture in general and to art in general, because it has affected me so broadly and deeply. We call this in the brochure a jazz talk, but we're just going to call it a talk today, because, and I'll embarrass Vijay for just a minute with saying a little bit about Vijay Iyer. Well, first of all, Vijay Iyer is one of the great collaborators in modern music, who works with many different artists. Tonight, you could hear him in a collaboration as part of the ensemble with the poet Aja Monet at the Dock Street Theater at 7 o'clock tonight. Vijay Iyer is also one of the more significant composers and leaders of small ensembles, and tomorrow night at the Satilli Theater at 7 p.m., you can hear the Vijay Iyer Trio, which for me, I don't even call it a trio. It's more like this organism with bassist Linda Mejano, drummer Taishan Sori, both of whom are also great composers and band leaders. And to me, this is like this wonderful organism that just keeps growing and changing shape, and you get to be in its presence, so you could be in its presence tomorrow night. As a master collaborator, one of the important collaborations that's current now is Vijay's work with the trumpeter and composer Wadada Leo Smith, with whom he just released a second recording, Defiant Life. And there is another organism of life around your compositions for what we might call classical or chamber music players. And for my father, a piece that Vijay composed for his father, was just performed at the reopened Frick in New York by pianist Sarah Rothenberg, who I think she commissioned that for Da Camera in Houston.
She premiered it a few years ago.
So, you know, I've followed closely Vijay's work as a musician, as a composer, as a collaborator on stages and recording studios, but also his work as a writer and a thinker about music and about just, the relationship between why we gather for performing arts and what sense it makes in our life. And part of the way that plays out is in his role as Franklin D. and Florence Rosenblatt Professor of the Arts at Harvard University, where he directs the PhD program in creative practice and critical inquiry. And maybe I'll quote Henry Threadgill, another great musician with whom Vijay collaborates, who told me, Vijay knows musical traditions, but he's no traditionalist. So anyway, that's a long, maybe slightly embarrassing introduction. There's a lot I'm sure we'll talk about, but can we start at the start, which is, I guess, did making music begin on violin for you?
Check 1, 2. Hi, everybody. Thank you all for being here on this afternoon. And thank you, Larry, for hosting me this week and for curating, can I say curating your ass off? Am I allowed to say that? Here at this festival. I got, when I was 3 years old and my sister was 6, I got signed up. Well, we both got signed up for music lessons. I think I chose violin because it begins with a V. I'm not sure, actually. What kind of logic can you attribute to a 3-year-old? I don't know. But my sister, whose name is Pratima, chose piano, which begins with a P. So maybe that's what happened. And so we sort of started in the Suzuki repertoire, and that was 1974. And I remember not long after we started, and my sister was, I'd hear her practicing, she was my big sister, and so she was kind of a big part of my world. And I remember hearing her play something I didn't recognize that wasn't from the Suzuki tapes. I'm like, what's that? And she was playing a lot of white keys, kind of like banging around, a lot of sustain pedal. And as I remember it, and this may be a kind of screen memory or something, I'm not even sure at this point, but I remember going up to the piano and banging along with her. And whatever happened in that moment is something I'd still try to access to this day, 50 years later. Mm-hmm. Every time I touch the piano, which is some kind of really primal, vibratory experience that was sensory, that was collaborative, that I wasn't even sure, like, is this music or is it not? That wasn't even a question. Mm-hmm. What it was a kind of ecstatic experience. And so every time I play, I'm trying to become that child again. Some part of me is. So that's, I guess, how it started. I didn't realize that until much later, that's right. Kind of my origin story, or whatever you want to call it.
And then your either learning piano or just practicing piano, that was a much less formal practice, I take it, than what you were doing on violin?
Yeah, so then these two paths kind of proceeded in parallel. For 15 years, I took violin lessons and I became okay, like functional. I played in the school orchestra and then in the youth symphony in Rochester, New York, where I grew up, and learned a bunch of the solo repertoire on violin, the Bach and Mendelssohn and Bruch and Saint-Saëns and all this stuff. I didn't go so far as like Tchaikovsky concerto. I wasn't quite good enough yet by the time. But I went, I don't know, I learned a bunch of the sonatas and partitas and stuff. But meanwhile, all along the way, concurrent to that, I was like this feral child on the piano. And just imitating whatever I heard and trying to make my way, trying to map what I heard to what the piano did and what I could do at the piano. So that usually meant trying to play along with the radio.
Yeah, all right, so this is like you're talking upstate New York.
70s and 80s,
You're growing up in upstate New York, the son of immigrants from India, and what was the stuff you were hearing? What was the music that was in your consciousness until you went off to college?
Well, if anyone remembers those years, if you turn on a radio in 1979, you either hear Sweet Home Alabama or Gladys Knight and the Pips, or something, and it was actually either or, and sometimes maybe if you found the classical station, then you'd hear like a lot of the chestnuts, like Beethoven's Fifth and stuff like that. So it was it was whatever was on the radio. I think like what really grabbed me in that moment, I know that what grabbed me in that moment was Prince and Michael Jackson, and the Police was another, and like, I don't know, to a lesser extent, like Genesis, or I don't know. It was a lot of that too. But Prince was really kind of like a touchstone figure for me because he had so much. I can't believe we'd have to talk about him in the past tense. I'm still not really okay with that. But he had so much musicianship. So, and then he was also one of the great performers of all time. So he could really communicate to you and it would feel like he was talking to you,
Right.
no matter who you are. I mean, I remember seeing him live in the 90s a few times. And one time I was at the back of the lawn at this outdoor amphitheater that had like 30,000 people there. And I really still had that feeling that it was like a show for me, So that kind of, and then the other thing about him was that he knew how to shape music.
When you heard him on the radio, even if it was 4 minutes long,
Yeah.
it was fully orchestrated.
Yeah.
It was whatever instrumentation was. It was an orchestrated piece of music.
Yeah, I remember when Purple Rain came out, and there was a girl who lived 2 doors down from me who just had it on her boombox on loop. You could make your cassette just kind of play over and over until it basically fell apart. And I remember she just spent the whole day shooting baskets and listening to Purple Rain, and it was just like my window was open, so I was like, what the hell is that? Especially like, if you guys know When Doves Cry, which is like on the radio all the time back then, that was the first single maybe from...
It's one of the greatest singles ever.
And there's no song like that.
Nope.
Before or since on the radio. Like nothing begins the way that song begins. There's no pop song that has no bass in it.
I was driving. I was driving in my
it
car with my 16-year-old son, and I gave him that exact speech about that same song. I played that song, and he said, "Okay," because he's 16.
Yeah, I remember I played it for my daughter, who's 20 now, and it was like probably 5 years ago. I'm like, "Can you believe this was 40 years ago?" She goes, "Yup."
Right. Yeah. Well, and so it goes. All right. So now, I know at a certain point when I first started talking to you, you told me about working toward a PhD in physics, and you said I was good enough at physics, but I didn't think I loved it. And here was this thing I did love, music.
See, the thing about Larry you need to know is that he's a critic and I'm a musician, but we've actually known each other for like a quarter century. And in fact, he's interviewed me many times, including, I was remembering the one time on stage in 2005 at Merkin Hall.
Yep.
It was maybe the first public time. So he can just quote himself.
No, but that was you. That was you.
No, I know. He can quote himself talking to me is what I mean.
Yeah. This is really just a continuation of an ongoing conversation.
But there's a scene missing in there, which is like when in my teens, because my high school had a jazz ensemble,
Right.
which they let me into even though I didn't know anything about this music, and they said, you should probably go study with this one guy who lives in town in Rochester, New York. He still lives there. He's still a great musician. Andy Calabrese is his name. And so I had about 3 lessons with him that summer of, I think it was 86. And, he showed me some very essentials about, by then I knew some music theory, but I didn't know so-called jazz theory, which meant I didn't know that what it is to read a lead sheet and then function as a pianist in a rhythm section. Like, how do you get from this page that has a melody and a bunch of pop cymbals to Sullivan Fortner, or something? Right. Or like in my case at that time, I started listening to Herbie Hancock and Keith Jarrett, and then eventually Thelonious Monk, and I was like, wait, this is all the same universe of music? These 3 right. extremely different pianists are dealing with the same information and producing such radically different results. How does this happen? So then Monk actually became my kind of, still is my main point of reference for everything in music. Mm-hmm. Sound and rhythm, phrasing, composition, form, band leading, this thing we call improvisation.
Imbalance.
Yeah. The humor, the seriousness,
Yeah.
the that vibratory experience I talked about. That's my 3 or 4-year-old self. I felt like whatever that version that was of hit for him, he was able to access it every time he played.
Right.
Which meant not just like, let's play, I'm a child, but actually, let's get to the essence of sound.
Right.
Yeah,
I
and that's
share that same fascination, and that the things begin and end for me with Monk. And that idea of that feeling together with this is something very old with very deep roots that's happening at the same time. So then, all right, did Steve Coleman enter your life before or after George Lewis?
It was right around the same time, actually.
Okay.
1994.
Okay.
Yeah, that was a kind of
Are we up to that part of the story?
there's. I think in your previous question you alluded to.
Yes, this moment
So.
This moment of intention, I guess, right?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know that the world would let me be an artist.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that I could. I didn't know I had it in me. I also didn't know that anybody like me had a right to do that. And of course, the fact is that it's our human birthright to be creative. So I should have known that, and I kind of did because I was making music anyway, but I didn't know that there would be a space for me in the world to do it, to make a life around it, and that hadn't yet been shown to me, that path, that possibility.
And you're talking about something much deeper than just, will I be good enough? You're talking about, is this even an available path for a person like me? Right.
Yeah, you can. That means all kinds of things.
Right.
A Scorpio? No, I don't know. Well, certainly when I looked out on the landscape of culture as a 18 to 20-year-old, I didn't see anybody like me in the U.S. doing anything in public. So I didn't imagine, when I say like me, I mean like with a name like mine, with skin color like mine, with parents like my parents. It wasn't obvious that was an option, Mm-hmm. And there's like historical reasons for that. Probably the main reason is that until 1965, American immigration law was racist, and it didn't let in many non-Western immigrants. The Immigration Act of '65 changed that so that suddenly then you had a new population of very carefully curated immigrants from outside the West, mostly with an education, with technical training, the H-1Bs, the F-1s, the ones who are being, who are being targeted right now. That was a new thing that happened 60 years ago in large numbers, let's say, which then meant that people like me and my sister were also new to this place, which meant that nobody had ever seen anybody like us before, around us. Like we were just, what is that? It was really this kind of feeling, experience that we had constantly, like every day of our lives. It's okay, I'm okay. I'm okay now. But it was confusing, and it felt like we had to tread lightly, like could we participate in culture? Could we be who we were in public? Like what does it mean to do that? And then, does anybody care what we have to say, right, or what our worldviews might be, as divergent as they are, as disparate as they are, I mean. And what, like when you're an artist in public, what you're doing is sharing something of your own subjectivity with the world, which means you're asking people to hear you out, and it wasn't obvious to me that that was something available. Anyway, I'll stop belaboring that, but I think like finally in 1994, I started to see that path, that potential, that sense of like, oh, maybe I will be allowed to show up in public as myself.
Right.
And play the piano somewhere. So it started to happen, and Steve and George were both a part of that moment.
So then, there's your own lineage and whatever contributes to who you are at that moment, but then you stepped very deeply into some other lineages and had access to them in a very interesting, informative way, right? In terms of, so maybe can we talk for a minute about the experience with Steve and the experience with George and where that led?
Sure. Well, basically, Steve Coleman asked me to join his group for a few tours from starting, the first one was 95, and it went on until 2000.
This is the saxophonist Steve Coleman, who has a long-running band, 5 Elements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I toured with him in Europe, and that was a bit of a trial by fire for me.
Mm-hmm.
I've been playing locally. By this time, I was living in Oakland, California, in grad school over there. That's a whole other story. But I, got sort of plucked out of obscurity and invited to be part of this internationally revered and adored artist, and his world and his music, and it was kind of like a boot camp in a way, because there was so much detail and discipline involved in executing his music. So I learned a ton. It was really formative for me. In those same years, I connected with the composer and scholar George Lewis, who is a member of the AACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians from Chicago, a generational, like a long-standing association of black musicians from the South Side of Chicago who organized around the need for self-determination, the need for artistic independence, starting in the 60s. So he became another part of my world. One of the, he himself is one of the smartest people I've ever met. He's, in addition to being a visionary instrumentalist and composer, he's also launched a few different academic fields that have been quite influential in music studies. And he became part of my PhD committee in the 90s, so he became like a kind of intellectual mentor to me.
And George Lewis, I always forget the exact title. Is it A Power Stronger Than Itself or A Power Stronger? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so George Lewis did write the book about the AACM, which is both, it's very much an oral history, but also a really good historical contextualization, Power Stronger Than Itself, which, frankly, I think any American would be wise to read. But now so there's a reason why, and it's very funny because later George went on to create an opera about the AACM's foundings in 1965, and it's the only opera that has a scene where people are singing about what to name their nonprofit organization. But it really is true. But there's a reason why they called it for the advancement not of this style or that style, the advancement of creative musicians, and not even of each musician finding their own way. And you've worked with and had connections with so many of either the first or second generation, George, Henry Threadgill, Wadada Leo Smith. I know you had some contact with Mullah Richard Abrams. And,
Roscoe also.
And of course, Roscoe Mitchell. And each one of them with their very own distinctives. But maybe that's a good segue into this idea of creative music, which I know is something that Wadada Leo Smith holds quite dear, and in fact wrote in the early 70s pretty much a treatise about it. But if we're going to talk about any term, what does that idea of creative music, creative musician mean to you? I mean, I know Wadada said it's somebody such that if you replace them in the music, then the music is not the same.
A creative musician is such a person. Yeah. So he's talking about the identity of that kind of artist rather than some notion of a style of music.
Right.
And I think the point is to remove or avoid the kind of genre distinctions that we got used to in the 20th century and maybe belong back there. We don't need them really so much anymore because they were artifacts of the record business from 100 years ago. And we're still stuck with them for some reason, but it's not really how music works.
You mean these ideas of that's jazz, that's chamber music, that's classical music?
Yeah, they're basically ways of categorizing human beings, which...
Right. Or economies.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can also say that... I mean, when I say that it was like these are music industry distinctions, these different genre terms, but there's also the phenomenon from the bottom up, from the ground up, which is what are artists doing with each other, and what are artists and audiences discovering together, you know? And that's a much more organic and open question, and it has to do with communities. You know, and if you think about these different terms as communities rather than as styles, then suddenly we're talking about people, right? We're talking about how people gather, how people listen to each other, what matters to them. And, you know, and then it can be local, or it can have a sort of historical framework for it that kind of explains how it got to be the way it is now, but also to understand then that it's still in flux like everything else in the world, that it's changing, you know.
Absolutely.
And so, you know, you will always have people who... the other thing about communities is that any of us can find ourselves affiliated with any number of communities, you know. Scorpios. No, I'm just kidding. People over 50. You know, Americans. Northerners. I don't know. So, like, you know, there's all these different ways that we kind of say that, well, this is who we are, and you're not one of those people, you know, or this is who we are, you could join us. Why don't you come along? And so that's really, to me, how music works, too. It's like, well, often, I mean, to me, when you hear music, you're kind of hearing a statement, this is who we are. But you're also being invited into it.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. It was very kind of you to compliment whatever I do that you might call curating, but really, it's just, I've gotten to know, I have privy to these musicians and their communities and what they're doing, and who wants to play with each other and why and what they're interested in doing, and just follow that. I mean, last night, Branford Marsalis' quartet played, and then afterwards, at a very nice restaurant in town, it sort of became a locus point for, okay, here's Etienne Charles, that was born in Trinidad and will be performing later this week. Here's Aja Monet, here's a bunch of musicians, and some people who are musicians, and some of the older musicians were telling their stories about what Blakey said or did, or what Betty Carter said. And it was less about what they said and did and more about their way of being, and talking about that and what there was a value to it. And everyone, it wasn't like everyone was crowding around a good joke. They were crowding around, this is what I experienced when I was 21 and I've never forgotten. Yeah. And somehow something I played tonight spoke of that.
Right.
Right, which is, it's a powerful thing to be around. So can we now, I guess, the values that you're talking about and the liberation of mind and talent that you're talking about, I guess that, you have to have that figure heavily into what you're doing at Harvard, which at Harvard, you basically invented that program, even that mode. I know when I went to, I got to sit in on a couple of classes, and one was Black Speculative Musicalities, and one was, one was a class simply called Musicality, I think.
Oh yeah, maybe.
Which was very powerful for me, because, let me, instead of talking so much, what did you want to initiate and enact with your position at Harvard? Or how has that played out?
I've been teaching there. I've been a professor at Harvard for almost 12 years. I think when I started, I applied for a job in composition. What composition means at Harvard is not what composition means to everybody. So what happened is they eventually came around to say, we'd like to hire you, but it won't be in composition.
Because you mean composition there means musicology and concertized.
No, it means, it's a very particular history of composing, of mainly European and modernists from sort of like a post-war European aesthetic. When I say war, I mean World War II. And it was mainly that the people who were on composition faculty there didn't see me as one of them.
Right.
I said, that's funny because everywhere else I go in the world, I'm known as a composer. So what happens when I walk in the door here?
Well, that word composer is very interesting. I mean, when I started what I might call my career, people weren't talking about Charles Mingus as a composer. They weren't even talking about Duke Ellington as a composer. Like that, really, even that is a fairly recent phenomenon. I'm not even necessarily sure that that's a good phenomenon, but it is a phenomenon.
So when I arrived at the Harvard Music Department, they had 4 existing doctoral programs. I mean, I was invited to I was brought in to teach undergraduate courses and graduate courses, and I could have my own PhD students. And I said, okay, but what are they in? Because there are 4 existing programs. There's composition, then there's music theory, historical musicology, and ethnomusicology. And the way the folks at Harvard saw it was that I could interact with all 4 of those programs based on what I do. Mm-hmm. I said, okay, cool, but then whom am I advising? And who are my students? So eventually it sort of fell to me to make a 5th program through which we could interact with all 4 other programs. So that's why it's called Creative Practice and Critical Inquiry. And what it's sort of doing is infiltrating, maybe decentering or slightly dismantling the conceits of any of those programs through our students who become fully fledged members of the department and interact with everybody. and are artists, and you know many of them.
Yes.
You've featured them and written about them. Some more Pindu Hughes and Ganavya Doraiswamy and Rajna
Rajna
Swaminathan and Somi and
All-
Fabian Almazan.
All musicians who have gone in very distinctive paths that they had to create themselves.
Yeah, so basically the way I saw it was we bring in artists who make their own way, because that's what I did. And that's what every artist that I know had to do. So we just give them help in terms of whatever resources the university can offer them across the whole spectrum of stuff, not just in the music department. So many of our students take courses from other departments, and whether it's art, film, and visual studies, or African American studies, or Somi was interested in taking a course on Black lyric. And I said, well, why don't you take this course that's called Black Lyric, that's taught by the former poet laureate of the U.S., Tracy K. Smith.
Mm-hmm.
That worked out pretty well. So,
Right.
so there's there are a lot of people that you can study with there who have a lot to offer, who aren't simply musicians. And all artists that I know are actually interdisciplinary. You had Cecile here the other day.
Yeah.
And I don't know if she got to present or talk at all about her visual art practice.
We did a talk like this, and
Yeah.
and her visual art is very much connected
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
And I find, and I mean, we could have a whole nother talk with the people that we were talking about a few moments ago, Roscoe Mitchell,
Yeah.
Wadada Leo Smith. Wadada's case, the visual art, which is really impressive, is literally the score. The score is encoded. It's not it's not a metaphor. It's encoded. But what I was really touched when I showed up. I mean, I was touched by a lot of the things those musicians who've been in your program had to say about. A lot of it, for them, it enabled them to understand what it would mean to have their own artistic intention, but then have the tools to do something with that, which are different than the tools of just playing well. And, but I was really touched when I encountered you had a class called musicality, because, I mean, in my work for years and years, I was trying to free myself of these really restrictive ideas about I'm going to be talking about whether music is good or bad. I'm going to be talking about whether it fulfills a need I already brought before the music was made, or whether I'm trying to fit it into some. And I ended up landing on my own version of actually some of what my response is based on what I would consider musicality. Do I feel like it's present? And I'm curious to know, when you have a class, what did you invest in that term, or what made you arrive at that term for a curriculum?
This was a seminar, so it was very self-selecting in terms of who took it. These are people who were interested in similar questions, which is not what is music, but what are we trying to say when we say that something is musical?
Right.
And that's a much larger question. Like the moment I talked about when I was 3 and banging on an instrument with my sister. That probably didn't yet qualify as music, right? Or maybe, I don't know. Depends. It's in the ear of the beholder. But I'm interested in that threshold and how we decide what that is, or how we come to believe we know what it is. And the reason I'm interested in that is because so many of us in this world find ourselves on the outside of that category. Not because, again, it depends on the ear of the beholder, right? Or more importantly, the standards, let's say, or the kind of tastes, or what governs the category of music? So these are the questions that we were trying to get at, and to understand that this is a construction we're talking about. This is a modern, we talk about music as if it's this substance that flows freely. But imagine if it was 200 years ago and you heard music. What that meant is that you heard people somewhere nearby making music, right? Or maybe you were one of those people. And so when we kind of reground ourselves in that moment of a sense of being called or hailed into a musical moment, what calls or hails us into that experience or that feeling of being held by music, being caught by music, being grounded in music, being asked to join us, being told this is who we are, you can come too. Those kinds of questions, which are so essential, are also so fraught in the way that we think and talk about them, in ways that we don't even notice we're doing. What does it mean, for example, when we say that that particular performance of the C major cello suite was very musical? Does that mean that other performances somehow lack this quality? So is it then this kind of like special thing we're saying about, so not all music is musical? Is that what that means? And then on the other hand, the way scientists will talk about the evolution of human musicality, which is the capacity to do anything towards the category of music, like have a steady pulse or sing in unison or something. So that's human musicality, these skills that we have. But those are sort of pre-musical, you might say.
Right.
So how is it that there's this term called musicality that both precedes and exceeds the category of music itself? Right. What it means is that none of these words are stable. Right. And instead, they all kind of trace out this critical space that asks more questions than it answers. The last thing I'll say about it is that a few years ago on Twitter, or the platform formerly known as Twitter, I asked, I don't know if you guys are meme types, but there was this meme that was basically like, well, what's not blank but sounds, or no, what's not blank but feels like blank to you? What's an example? Well, what's not racist but feels racist to you? That was a very popular one. But what I put it out there as what's not music but feels like music to you. Right. And I got hundreds of responses. I'm not very popular on Twitter, I gotta say, but this one touched a nerve, and it really, it was heard around the world, and I got hundreds of answers from all over the planet. And what it traced out was this vast field of human experience. Washing machines, leaves blowing, the sound of my children's voices, grandparents was another answer, love was another answer, people arguing in Yoruba was another answer. There's really all kinds of human phenomena that feel adjacent to the category but don't belong in it, But once we open that door, we realize that this category never ends.
There are so many people and musicians I could throw out names that we'll talk about. Some of them we've already talked about. But one musician that I know we've shared a fascination with about is the late great pianist Jerry Allen, who I know, I went to hear anytime I could, and still listen to her music all the time. And I know that you've recorded her drummer song more than once, and you've written a very eloquent and very insightful essay, a scholarly piece about, or at least part of a scholarly piece about that. Can we talk a little bit, like, why is Jerry, what did Jerry's music and her approach to the piano, how did that affect you, or why is this such a fascination for you?
One of the, to just touch on the previous topic for a second, one of the things that seems true about what we call musicality is that it means that this moment matters.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't always know why. Usually don't know why. In fact, it's more effective if we don't know why. And I don't know why the first time I heard her play, it was like one of the great moments of my life. I don't know why, but it was.
What was the context? When and where?
It was the record Etudes,
Okay.
Charlie Hayden, Paul Motion, and Jerry Allen, and the opening bars of that version of Lonely Woman.
Ornette Coleman composition.
It's this spacious, mysterious field that's set out by this pedal point in the bass, and suddenly you hear this hand emerge from the mist and caress the keys in this way that was part singing, part dancing, part speaking. And I just was grabbed from that moment, and I'll never let go.
And
she was that kind of artist.
Yep.
And we all live our lives hoping for a moment like that. That happened to me in those opening moments of hearing that. I think it was even on a cassette. So, 1989. I remember where I was, even, So that's the kind of thing that, even thinking about it sends chills down my spine.
And of course, a moment like that doesn't have other context or needs no context, but there is some context of that is a Ornette Coleman composition. Ornette Coleman, through his life, didn't choose to work with many pianists, and he had reasons he could tell you why he was excluding the piano, but Jerry Allen was a pianist that he did choose to work with, and she actually found a way into his harmonic world. It was that was different than anyone else's way in. So, we could talk for a full hour about Drummer's Song, but can you share a little bit about why that piece of music is so fascinating for you?
Well, I should say that let's see, that was 1989, and then I recorded Drummer's Song in 2019. So in the 30 years in between that, I, really, really listened to her, initially, constantly. Everything that she was on that I could get my hands on, records by Ralph Peterson, and eventually, more and more of her own stuff as a leader. And there were these different facets of her playing, her composing, her sense of rhythm, her playfulness with melody, her defiance of the kind of norms of jazz piano in the 80s. She just had her own way. She made her own way, it felt to me in common with Monk and with Andrew Hill and with Herbie Nichols, to name 3 pianists that she admired. It just had its own mystery in it. Drummer's Song is one of her earliest compositions. It's from the 80s, actually. There's a version of it on this album called Open on All Sides from, I think, 87. And then she recorded it a couple more times. One is in the trio with Tony Williams and Ron Carter. And the other that I came across was a live recording from Europe in the late 90s. And it kept changing. Every version was so different, but it had this particular compositional backbone that really has all this, is just so immensely appealing. It really, it rocks, what can I say? And and hearing these different drummers approach this piece that's clearly made as a tribute to drummers has been thrilling. And then, I got to know her after I moved to New York in the late 90s, and she became actually a dear friend and mentor and supporter. She just was really in my corner in a way that was so unexpected and loving. And I never really knew why. I just feel so blessed to have known her and to have been in the world with her. I remember one time I went to a gig of hers at the Vanguard, actually. She was playing with Terry Lynn Carrington, who I'm playing with in a few hours.
And
the drummer.
And
Esperanza Spalding, this trio that they had, which was so magical. After the gig, she said, "Vijay, come here, I'm going to drive you home." I'm like, "Why are you driving me home from your gig? This is, you don't need, are you sure?" And she said, "Yeah, it's on my way," because I live in Harlem, and she lived in Montclair, New Jersey. And we had just bought this, my wife and I had just bought this brownstone in Harlem. And she dropped me off. She's like, "That's your house?" I said, "Yeah, we just got it." And she said, "You're a Huxtable now." And she said, "Can you play in there?" I said, "Yeah. Yeah, my piano's on the ground floor." She said, "Do you have drums?" I said, "No." She said, "I'm going to give you a set of drums." And I was like, I didn't believe her, so I just let it go. I just kind of kept it moving. I was like, "So, what are you doing next?" I didn't. But then after that, every time I saw her, she'd be like, "I want to give you these drums. When are you coming over to get these?" I'd see her across the room. She'd be like, "Come on, come get the drum." So finally, I remember it was New Year's Eve or around the holidays in December of 2016 that I finally rented a car and drove to Montclair and picked up these drums. It's a Rogers kit, which she actually toured in Timeline with. And in fact, the bass drum had a head that said Jerry Allen in Timeline. I said, "I think maybe you want to keep this." And she said, "All right, I'll keep it." But yeah, she gave me a bunch of stuff.
Wow.
Which I still have.
And
then she passed away 6 months later. So she knew, actually, that she was on her way out, but she didn't tell any of us. So
No.
I was so blindsided by it. I was not ready. I still can't believe that she's not in this world with us. She was only 60 when she passed. Right. And trying to keep it together.
Right.
So then I was like, well, look, Jerry Allen was a genius. She's one of the great composer pianists of all time. So anything I can do to remind people of that is worth doing.
That's part of why I asked.
And so that's why I sought to study and learn more and more of her music. And so that was one such piece.
That's why I asked. And as a matter of fact, yeah, that happened more quickly than any of us would have realized. And she and that trio you mentioned were going to perform here.
Yeah.
And what we ended up doing was Terry Lynn Carrington came and gathered some of the musicians and
Yeah.
did, it was called a tribute, but it was more like a seance.
Yeah.
This was like several years ago.
Yeah, we did a few, I participated in
Yeah,
a
and
couple
that
of those.
was
One at Newport Jazz
Powerful
Festival.
too. So I want to invite a couple of questions, and I know we're already nearing our eventual end, but if I have you here, I need to ask about, I remember after 9/11, after the attacks of September 11th, 2001, one of the pieces of art that helped me in the long, extended moment that followed that was that project, In What Language, that you did with Mike Ladd, the poet, spoken word artist. And, if I listen to the things you say from stages, on stage at the Village Vanguard, before concerts, or Combat Breathing, a piece that I remember you did that corresponded to what they called a die-in at Brooklyn Academy of Music, those things have been valuable for me in moments to understand, well, how can art or me understand this moment? So this is a moment, too, where I've been spending a lot of time thinking about how does artists, music function in this moment and connect to whatever we're experiencing politically, socially. That's a long lead up to, this. I guess, I'm not sure what I'm asking, but I guess I'm asking, it appears that there's been this very natural but also very intentional correspondence between what you're doing artistically and what you want to say socially and politically. Is that just a natural part of being, or is that something that you think about?
It's something I was trained to do, both by my own life experiences and by all the people who mentored me. Which is to say, how do you speak from your vantage on the world? And like I said, when I was growing up, the vantage of a person like me had no place in society. We weren't. Nobody wanted to know what we were thinking or feeling. Nobody even thought we had feelings. When I started working with Amiri Baraka, the first time I worked with him was in 1996 in Oakland. And then when I moved to New York, he had me over to the house in Newark and invited me to play at his salon in his basement on this broken old piano. And, then he invited me to tour with him. And in fact, the first travel I did after 9/11 was with him. And being in the world with him, experiencing, witnessing it the way he did, both being in the world as an artist and as somebody who does politics in the sense of trying to apply pressure in certain places. There's a beautiful quote from him where he says, the only reason we do politics is to make room for art.
Wow.
To make room for truth and for beauty. There's no other reason. So another thing he said, I remember, is I'm here for truth and beauty just like the next guy. The only problem is sometimes something gets in the way. Which is basically the same statement,
Right.
So this is it. It's how do we assert that human beings matter, that human life matters, that everybody has a right to human rights. So yeah, I mean, it's never been separate because the reason that any of this music exists is through a practice of what I would call defiant life.
Right. Hence that title. Yeah, I mean, I do feel like, I believe that as people get further and further apart and have fewer and fewer ways to communicate in constructive ways without throwing up walls and art and hostilities, which I think is really increasing. That I remember a long time ago, I was writing a piece for the Village Voice. This is like 20 years ago, about an ensemble of Israeli and Palestinian musicians. And they were touring in the U.S., and the Library of Congress presented them, but made them remove the word peace from their program notes. And I interviewed this one Palestinian musician, and he said, well, we want to reach you at a place that CNN can't touch. And I do believe that that's, I mean, I feel like you're living in that place. You're bringing me into that place.
I like to be in places that CNN can't touch.
Okay. We have only limited time, but does anyone have a question they'd like to ask Vijay Iyer? All right, so we're gonna try to be, as they say, fair and balanced. Oh, that's the other network that's fair and balanced.
Is there a mic? Oh, there's.
Yeah. How about, let's start with this gentleman here. Right here. Over here in the blue shirt here.
I didn't know I'd be singing. So, you talked about collaboration. You worked with Trio 3 as the pianist in the trio.
Yeah.
And in fact, I was fortunate enough to hear you here in Charleston a few years back with the trio. What was that experience like? Because you recorded and, of course, you toured.
Yes, that was. The gentleman's referring to the long-standing trio of the great Reggie Workman, the great Andrew Surreal, and the great Oliver Lake. Kind of a Mount Rushmore of creative music right there. Mm-hmm. And they, respectively bass, drums, and saxophone. They did a series of projects with guest pianists. And so I got to be one in a series that also included Jerry Allen and Jason Moran and David Berdeus. And maybe someone else, Irene Schweitzer, right? I think she did one too. Yes.
Caroline Chris Bell, yes.
That's right. Good call. So that was always, well, I'd been listening to Mr. Workman as long as I'd been listening to this music. I mean, I think, I remember listening to Coltrane live at the Village Vanguard when I was in high school, and Mr. Workman's on that record, and here I am like 30, 40 years later playing with him. And with, I had gotten to know each of them individually and gotten to work with each of them in different contexts. In fact, the first time I got to play with Mr. Workman was in Amir Baraka's band in one of these events we did, a political event. We did actually, I think it might have been a fundraiser for his son, Ras Baraka, actually, maybe 20-something years ago. The first time I worked with Andrew Surreal was in this ad hoc ensemble playing with some poets. Oliver Lake, I got to play some duets with and different things. So they'd all been in my life in different ways, and when I was invited to join this illustrious series of guest pianists with that group, I was awestruck and I was really excited. I remember so the year was 2013 when we first recorded and first played together as this Trio plus one, Trio 3 plus one. And, well, they invited me to write music and bring compositions. That year was the year of the non-indictment of George Zimmerman.
Right.
That summer. And so that's when I wrote this piece called Suite for Trayvon and Thousands More, which it was natural for, it was like an obvious thing for them for each of them to take on a piece like that. It fit right in with their existing repertoire in terms of the concerns, the sense of what matters, the sense of place in the world. I have so many wonderful memories of getting to work with each of them, and I still am in touch with all of them and I got to play with Mr. Workman last year in a tribute to Andrew Hill. And I just saw him a couple months ago when I played with Wadada. He came out to hear us. Cyril and I have played together with Wadada. So I still have like many ongoing affiliations with all of them. But that particular unit, we really got into some exciting spaces that I'd never experienced before. Like really these like moments of what felt like dissolution of the self, where you almost have this out-of-body experience where you don't know where the music is coming from. It's almost like you become a channel for something. And that's because those guys are tapped in at that level. So that as soon as you sit down next to them, you just gotta buckle up. And the other one of the other great blessings of that project that we did is that Mr. Baraka wrote the liner notes. And that was one of the last things he wrote, actually, before he passed in 2014. I'll try not to cry again.
Yeah. I think we can do one more. And maybe this woman who's been patiently waiting at the Mass. I'm sorry we can't get to all the questions.
Thank you. My name is Elsa Nazario, and I'm a volunteer at the Newark Museum. And I was very fortunate that I started volunteering in 2011, and he was alive at that time.
Yes.
And because of the Jazz in the Garden that we had in the summer, every Thursday afternoon, I learned to love jazz and meet a lot of musicians that I didn't know that I was going to ever meet just by volunteering at the New York Museum. I just want to say, I loved what you talked about him because of the years I spent in that museum with the Jazz in the Garden.
Yes. Thank you.
Good. I think that's our alarm. That's our.
Can we take-
all right, let's
do
do
one
one more. This gentleman here. This guy's arm ring. Right. All right. Okay.
I'd like for you to agree or disagree with my assessment that not everyone possesses the ability at 3 years old that you did. Literally, I mean, it's innate, it's in your DNA, and not everyone has that. I believe that what I just said is correct. Do you agree or disagree?
Wow.
I'm going to answer with a little anecdote, which is there's a famous classical pianist named Robert Levin who used to teach at Harvard. And in fact, he retired the day I arrived. I tried not to take it personally. But later, in fact, just a few months ago, a student of mine said, "Oh, I ran into your old colleague, Robert Levin." And I said, "Actually, we never were colleagues because he left the day I arrived." And she said, "Well, I told him that I'd been studying with you. And apparently, here's what he said to her. Oh, that Vijay Iyer guy. He thinks anybody can play music."
Okay.
And I do. And I know, in fact, it's not that I think it. I just know it's true. I would just invite, well, first of all, you don't know what it sounded like, and neither do I, frankly, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't music yet.
And that is going to be our final word. But I would add that anyone can also hear music. Not only certain people can hear music. Anyone can hear music and appreciate it. Please, I know Vijay's going to rush off and get to sound check for Aja Manet for tonight, which frankly is an all-star band in my account. And tomorrow evening, that magnificent trio of his will be at the Sotilli Theater, and I know I'll be there listening closely. Please help me thank Vijay's always been very generous in you.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you.